Good evening, brothers and sisters in the Dhamma. Good evening, Bhante. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. So, welcome to the third in a series of Science of Dhamma forum. Tonight's topic is actually talking about the science of emotion. And here we are going to explore the teachings of the Buddha using the translations, the interpretations, and the explanations of Bhante Punnaji, and also drawing from the field of science, of various science disciplines, right? From medicine, biology, neuroscience, and psychology. We bring in findings from those fields and to try to explain the Buddha's teaching in a scientific way. We know that the Buddha actually was a very scientific teacher. Many things he taught 2,500 years ago are only beginning to be discovered by modern science. And today, many of the new discoveries about our body, about our mind, about the brain, the Buddha already spoke about it in some ways. Of course, in ancient times, the Buddha could not use some of the scientific terms, right, to tell people there is a brain. People don't understand that. But the Buddha did use various ways to explain to people, and I'm going to show you later on some of the simple ways the Buddha explained to people very scientific aspects of his teaching. So today we're going to take a look at this whole process of experience, and we're going to focus on emotion. Let's do a quick recap of what we have covered in the process of experience. During the first session, we talked about how environmental activities stimulate our sense organs, and that gave rise to the Panchakanda producing a mental image, right? That you have seen, heard, smelled, taste, or touched something. And this arising of this awareness of what we have seen, heard, smelled, taste, and touch is vijnana, the big picture. And Bhante translates that as perception. It is commonly translated as consciousness, vijnana. Now, I want to point out again, the word consciousness means many different things to many different people. Even if you ask scientists, there is no consensus or unanimous agreement to what is the meaning of the word consciousness. So to use vijnana, to call vijnana consciousness can also be quite confusing. But a more precise word is actually perception, percept. It is a very scientific explanation. Percept means what has been perceived through the sense organs. That's what it is. Vijnana is simply what has been perceived through the sense organs. There has not been any thought or any emotions or any reactions to it yet. Basically, it's just what was perceived through the sense organs. And from what was perceived through the sense organs, last session we talked about how we then try to interpret the meaning. And the interpretation of meaning is the work of mano, the cognitive process. What does the mano do? What the mano does is that based on this perception, this vijnana, it then refers to memory of past experiences. And this process is called papancha, referring to categorized memory of past experiences, trying to give meaning to what had been perceived. And this giving meaning is actually the recognition process, right? And this is identifying what was perceived. So this is an experience in itself. Bhante always likes to teach us to think in experiential terms and not in existential terms. So this experience is Dhamma. The word Dhamma here means experience. We experience something. And then we form a concept by trying to make stories in the mind. Concept that we have now seen this dog out there. So the seeing of the dog giving rise to a mental image, there is a dog in our mind, and then giving it a name called dog, this is the process of nama rupa. Rupa is this mental image that, oh, I have seen a dog. There's a mental image arising. And nama is giving it a label, giving it a name, identifying it. Right? So this is the categorized identity. So this is what we covered last week, and this is the process of conception. conceiving ideas and thoughts and stories about what we have seen, heard, smelled, tasted, or touched. Tonight, we're going to take a look at it one step further and say, now what happens? Based on what was perceived, we then experience this feeling, whether it is pleasant or unpleasant. And this leads to a reaction. Experiencing this pleasant or unpleasant feeling leads to a reaction. And this is the work of the chitta. The chitta reacts to it. And this reaction is the beginning of what scientists call emotion. Because emotion is actually quite a complex thing. It's not just mental thoughts or negative thoughts. Until about 100 years ago, scientists used to think that emotion is just thinking, right? In the mind. Emotion is only in the mind. But since about 100 years ago, the time of William James, they have basically come to the idea, the realization that emotion begins with some changes in the body, and then the mind reacts. This whole process of bodily change and the mental reaction is emotion. So emotion is not just one thing, not only in the mind, it involves the body. In fact, it involves the body first. And when the body reacts, and then the mind begins to react to it, then we form affection. Whether we like something, we don't like something. So the liking and not liking is an emotional reaction. Whether we like a certain sensation, whether we enjoy a certain kind of food, we like what we see, pleasant sensations, all this is affection. And that leads to having a certain emotional mood and temperament. And this is really a complete process of emotion. With emotional reaction, we begin to want to do something. The wanting to do something is a mental karma. And this is really chetana. This volition, the intention of wanting to do something. That intention in itself is chetana, the volition. The common word for this is volition or intention, you could say. And with intention, we then take action. The action taken is called karma. So karma is the action part of an intention. You want to do something, now you actually physically do it. That is the karma. And with every karma, there are consequences. So the consequence is vipaka. So these three things go together. Chetana, karma, vipaka. When you have a chetana, then you have karma, and with karma, you have vipaka. And vipaka may ripen immediately. It may ripen later on. It may ripen at the end of your life. It may even ripen in your next life. Generally, most of it would ripen within the present life. But of course, the complexity of when karma will ripen, we really cannot say. In fact, the Buddha pointed out in one of the sutras that there are 4 things we cannot try to comprehend. And the working of the karma, the result of karma, how karma ripens, that is something that we can never ponder. Because if we try to ponder that, we go crazy thinking about it. This is found in the Anguttara Nikaya. Right, Book of Force, I think it is Sutra number 77, where it talked about those 4 things you cannot try to comprehend and try to explain. Right? And the working of karma is one of them. How does karma ripen? Right? How do we get results from karma? Right? So when vipaka ripens, it comes back to affect your life. Right? Whether you're talking about immediately, later on, at the end of your life, or in your next life, it will come back and affect you. So basically, this is the whole process of experience, from seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching, to finally ripening of karma. Right? Today, we are just going to focus on one very important topic, and that is emotion. Basically, how, after interpreting what we have seen, heard, smelled, tasted, and touched, we now form ideas, and these ideas cause us to react in some ways. And this reaction is a combination of bodily reaction and mental reaction. And that is emotion. Right? The affective process of mind, or what Bhante points out is chitta. So, in a nutshell, what we're going to cover today is that we're going to look at emotions the two dimensions of emotion. Right? First, we talk about physiological dimension of emotion, the physical part of emotions. Right? Basically, this is the part that causes us to suffer physically, the physical suffering. And this is what Buddha calls dukkha. There are two kinds of suffering, physical suffering and mental suffering. So, physical suffering is dukkha. Then there is also a psychological reaction or psychological suffering, and that is distress. Right? Physical is stress, psychological is distress. That's domanassa. So we're going to take a look at how emotions turn into dukkha and domanassa, and then we're also going to look at the activities of emotion itself. Emotion, the activities of emotion comes in two parts. First, the arousal. Arousal of emotion is the result of this feeling of the sensation, whether something is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And this is the Vedana, the subjective feelings of everything we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. Every sensation, everything we see, every time we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch something, there is a feeling associated with that sensation. Right? The sensation is sanya, the feeling is Vedana. So they always go together. And this feeling is pleasant, sukha, or unpleasant, dukkha. And it will lead to some kind of reaction. And this is emotional reaction. Bhante calls tanha as emotional reaction. The word tanha is often translated as craving. But I'll show you why emotional reaction is a more precise explanation, a more scientific way of explaining tanha. Right? And not only we're going to take a look at emotions, we're actually going to connect with the original teachings of the Buddha. And what was the first original teachings of the Buddha? What is commonly called the Four Noble Truths. Chattari Arya Sachani. This is what Bhante Punnaji calls fourfold supernormal reality. Right? The Four Noble Truths. And in the Four Noble Truths, it was explained very clearly there are three types of tanha. And then today we're going to explore up to that point, the three types of tanha. But it is important to point out that at the same time when there is tanha, it will lead to upadana, clinging and grasping. Right? What Bhante Punnaji actually very accurately translate as personalization, a scientific explanation of this process of upadana is personalization. We personalize every experience and say, this is me, mine, my experience. We see something, we say, I see, that I arises. So the I, me, and mine arises in our mind with every experience, and that is clinging, grasping, attachment, personalization, upadana. And of course, that leads to the mind creating the idea, oh, there is a self. I am experiencing something. You know, there is this experience. But this experience really is a reaction of the mind. But we think that the body is the self. So thinking the body is the self is this process called Sakkaya Ditthi. So we will not be exploring so much upadana, and we won't be talking about Sakkaya Ditthi today, but I need to point out to you that because they are all connected. Right? Tanha connected with upadana, connected with Sakkaya Ditthi, which leads to the renewal of existence. Bhava. We are reborn over and over again. So today we're going to take a quick look at all various aspects of emotions and the reactions. And basically, we refer back to the three levels of Arya Magga books that Bhante has published. So again, just as a reminder, the page numbers in black is referring to the Buddhist Maha Vihara edition. The page numbers in purple is referring to the Mahindarama edition. Right, because there are some things added to the Mahindarama edition, so the page numbers no longer align. You notice that in this particular page, Bhante did mention something about upadana. right? The process of clinging. So we're going to talk about upadana in the next session. So today we're just going to look at emotions. It is very important to understand emotions from a scientific perspective. The reason is once you've understood that, you will then find it easier to understand how upadana arises, and further on, in fact, this whole notion of thinking that the body is the self, the Sakkaya Ditthi. So the next session, I'm going to be able to explain Sakkaya Ditthi and upadana and Sakkaya Ditthi from a scientific perspective. So now when we talk about this whole process of experience, what is experience? Now, Bhante pointed out, first, let us consider ourselves as organisms in an environment. And at the same time, when as organisms in the environment, we're able to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch, then we form perceptions, vijnana. And perception is the reaction of the organisms to stimulation. Because when light enters the eye, then it triggers the light-sensitive cells at the back that actually causes a whole chain reaction, right? From sanya, vedana, sankhara, vijnana, and then rupa. And then we begin to create concepts and give it meaning, right? So basically this is the whole process. So looking at what Bhante taught us in the book, we're going to very quickly run through it one more time. Who are we? We are organisms in an environment. As organisms in an environment, two things are happening to us, which is beyond our control. We can't control it in the sense that it is happening automatically. First, the body is alive because of metabolism, the cells absorbing energy and multiplying. So this is a life-sustaining process, metabolism. At the same time, we are equipped with 5 physiological senses or 5 physical senses that enables us to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch from the environment. Activities in the environment will stimulate our sense organs. We can't stop it in the sense. If light enters the eye, we will see. If sound enters the ear, we will hear. So all this is happening, right? So as organisms in the environment, we are also living in a very complex environment. A lot of things are happening. So we react to all this complexity. How do we react? First, we look at it from a scientific perspective, that we react because of the way our body has evolved. So we are equipped with a body that comes with a central nervous system made of 2 important parts. The first is the spinal cord, and the second part is the brain. So the spinal cord is connected to peripheral nervous system, which is in turn connected to our sense organs. So when light enters the eyeball, right, it triggers light-sensitive cell and it causes an impulse that goes to the brain. So that is how it works. Similarly, when sound enters the ear, it triggers a chain reaction inside the ear with our eardrum vibrating, and then it causes impulses into the auditory nerves that is brought to the brain. So everything is processed in the brain, and then this processing in the brain then leads to a reaction in the brain, and then the brain sends messages down to the rest of the body to then react. If we see something we don't like, we want to push it away. We see something we enjoy, we may want to hang on to it. So all these are the reactions. So there is a very important point that we have to understand. The brain and the mind. What is the brain? What is the mind? When you ask a lot of people, where is your mind? Most people point up here. Well, you're not pointing to your mind, you're pointing to your brain. The mind, the Bhante has pointed out very clearly, the mind does not exist. There is no existence. The mind is an activity of the brain. When the brain has these biochemical reactions going on, actually it's electrochemical reactions. 2 things are happening inside the brain. Exchanges of electrical impulses and exchanges of chemicals. So it's electrochemical reaction between neuron cells. Right? Neuron cells are the cells inside the brain. So this exchanging of electrical impulses and chemicals between cells causes a lot of activity going on, and this activity gives rise to the mind. The mind is an activity. The mind is not an entity. It doesn't exist. You can't hold on to it and say, this is the mind. There's no such thing as mind. Mind is an activity. Right? So the same with this mind, this activity of the mind that is going on up there. You can write down what you think. You can write down how you think. You can draw what appears in your mind. But drawing the picture is not the mind. Right? The mind is an activity. You cannot hold on to it. You cannot see it, touch it, feel it. It's an activity. So it's when I talk about the brain, then I'm not talking about the mind. But when I talk about the activity of the brain, then I'm talking about the mind. So pay attention when I start talking about the brain. There will be two aspects of it. I will be talking about the physical part of the brain. Then that is not the mind. And I will also be talking about the activity of the brain. And then I'm talking about the mind. So you will find me talking about mind and brain interchangeably, but I'm not referring to exactly the same thing. Just be aware. So when I talk about the brain, it is the activity of the brain, which is the mind. So when we look at the brain itself, the brain has evolved over millions of years into three parts. The most ancient part is the brain stem. This keeps us alive. The brain stem causes autonomic functions in the body to work properly. Digestive system, respiration, cardiovascular system, the heart beating, right? The lungs breathing. So all this is autonomic reactions in the body. And the brain stem is controlling that. Then comes the next part of the brain, the limbic system, the emotional brain. This is commonly called the emotional brain because in this part of the brain, there's a lot of activity that triggers the release of chemicals in the body. So this is the part of the brain that controls glands in the body to release various kinds of hormones. And it is the hormones that is being released in the body that causes physical reaction in the body. So that's why this part of the brain is called the emotional brain. Because the activity of this brain actually causes all these reactions in the body, the biochemical reactions in the body. On the outermost of the brain, then there is this thing called the cerebral cortex, the thinking brain. This is the most evolved part of the most recently evolved part of the brain that enables us to think. So, activity of the brain is the mind. So then what are thoughts? Well, thoughts arise when there is activity in the limbic system. Thoughts arise when there is activity in the cerebral cortex. What kind of thoughts? Activity in the limbic system will lead to emotional thoughts. Activity in the cerebral cortex will lead to rational thoughts. But they are not strictly divided in that sense because they are sort of overlapping in many ways. So in other words, cerebral cortex can also be responsible for certain emotional thoughts. Right? So they are overlapping. Today's science has not reached a level where it is able to draw clearly what is emotional thought, what is conscious, rational thoughts. We can sort of appreciate what it is after it has happened, but at the time it is happening, we can't really draw a clear line. So at the moment, today's science is not able to decipher and define this distinctly and clearly. So we have to realize that. So based on what we know from science so far, then I'll just try to explain a little bit more about emotions. So when we talk about the emotional brain, this is a very important thing. There are two parts in the brain which is responsible for two extremes. One part of the brain is responsible for causing suffering. Right? All kinds of emotional reactions and suffering. Another part of the brain is really responsible for your happiness. So when you exercise certain brain functions, then different parts of the brain are active. Right? So when you are experiencing emotions, then the emotional brain is very active. But when you are consciously thinking or when you are meditating, then the thinking brain takes over. So we have to be aware. So I'm going to show you these two parts of the brain. One part responsible for your suffering, the other part responsible for your happiness. This part is responsible for your suffering. Deep inside this emotional brain, there is a little thing called the amygdala. Very important word. Remember this. The amygdala. Amygdala is a tiny little tissue, one on each hemisphere. We have two hemispheres, two halves of the brain. On each side, there is an amygdala, right? So one on each side. This amygdala is just a tiny little thing about the size of your thumbnail. You know how small is it? It is just the size of your thumbnail, right? And it is attached to the end of this hippocampus. Hippocampus is the part of the brain responsible for organizing memory. So in other words, amygdala and memory are very closely associated. As soon as amygdala is aroused, it actually goes and triggers chain reactions in memory. So what does the amygdala do? Now, the amygdala has a very useful function. The amygdala has evolved over millions of years to help protect us from harm. How does it do that? It scans everything we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. Every time we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch something, that information passes through the amygdala first. It reaches the amygdala twice as fast as before it reaches the thinking brain. So in other words, your amygdala is aware of what you see, hear, smell, taste, and touch, and your amygdala reacts to it long before you are aware consciously what you have seen, heard, smelled, taste, and touch. That means the moment you see something, before you even realize what you are looking at, the amygdala has already started reacting to it. That's how fast it is. You have to be very careful. That's why we can't control the amygdala. We can't stop it from reacting because we are never aware when it is reacting. And it is so fast that we can't even fathom how fast it is. Some scientists have measured it. Right? Earlier on, when they started measuring it, they say the reaction is about 100 millisecond. 100 millisecond is 1/10 of a second. But today, they realize that it may even be down to 10 to 20 millisecond. 10 to 20 millisecond is 100th of a second. Right? That's how fast the amygdala reacts. Even before you realize what you see, the amygdala reacts. How does the amygdala react? When the amygdala reacts, it actually triggers a chain reaction that causes hormones to be released. And this leads to a condition in the body called the fight or flight reaction. In fact, there are three conditions: fight, flight, or freeze. When it is something you have never seen before, it will trigger the freeze reaction. You see, when you see something frightening for the first time ever, you've never seen that before, your whole body freezes. That is the freeze reaction. When it is something you realize is threatening you, then there are two reactions. You either want to fight against it or you want to run away from it. When you want to fight against it, that is the fight reaction. When you want to run away from it, it is the flight reaction. So it triggers these three kinds of reactions in the brain. And this is really how the amygdala reacts. And this is actually a very physiological reaction. It causes hormones to be released in the body. Your whole body reacts. I'll give you a simple example. You walk down the street and then a car coming towards you. From the corner of your eye, you notice a car coming towards you or something coming towards you. Before you even have a chance to look at what is coming towards you, whether it is a car, whether it's going to hit you or not hit you, your whole body would have reacted. You would have jumped out of the way. That jumping out of the way is a physiological reaction that was first triggered by the amygdala. Right? Or sometimes you walk down the jungle path or just the roadside along the bush, and then you step on something. You know that area may have some snakes or whatever. Then you step on something and suddenly your whole body freezes in fear. And then your whole body freezes in fear, thinking that you might have stepped on a snake. Now, how does your body freeze in fear? It's the amygdala. The moment you step on something, the amygdala immediately triggers the memory and then realize that this may look like a snake. And what happens? It causes your whole body to freeze up. And then you look at what you stepped on. Oh no, it's just a stick or a branch. You feel relaxed. So seeing that it is a branch happens much long after your body has reacted. The same thing, you're sitting there reading a book peacefully, quietly, engrossed in what you're reading. Your very good friend comes from behind you and you didn't realize. All he did was just touch you on the shoulder. The moment he taps you on the shoulder, your whole body reacts. See, this reaction of the body is the work of the amygdala. And then you turn around and you say, oh, it's my friend, and then you feel more relaxed. That's my friend. That is your conscious mind, your thinking mind, realizing, this is not a threat. Take it easy, relax. But the amygdala, when it senses this touch, it reacts because it considers this sudden touch as some kind of a threat. That's what the amygdala does. The amygdala is there to sense potential threats and cause your body to react so that it protects you from potential harm. So the amygdala has two paradoxical roles. So the first one is what I have just described. It's like a bodyguard. It is there to sense potential threats and actually cause your whole body to react in such a way so that it actually protects you from threats, harm, and danger. But then again, the other role of the amygdala, unfortunately, the amygdala can be aroused unnecessarily. So when the amygdala is aroused unnecessarily, it causes your body to react in a stressful way, and that stress is very unhealthy. And that basically means it's like a terrorist in your body. So the amygdala has two roles. It is your bodyguard, it is also your terrorist. And it's very important to realize this. Yeah. So in other words, a lot of people think, the amygdala is the bad guy. No, the amygdala is not necessarily a bad guy. It's there to protect your life. When fast approaching objects, you jump out of the way, your life is being saved by the reaction of the amygdala. But at the same time, when the amygdala is unnecessarily aroused, your whole body becomes all stressed up. Right? So this was mentioned also in Bante's books on page 104. So up to this point, you now have a rough idea, basically, how the brain works. And let's take another look at what the scientists have to say about how the brain works.
As humans have evolved, it's doubled in size. It weighs only 3 pounds, but it consumes 20% of all the fuel our bodies take in, generating enough energy to keep a light bulb burning.
And you have to consider the brain having evolved like an old house, where we just added different rooms. And so there's all these stairways and connections.
In the basement is the oldest part, called the brain stem. It's something we share with reptiles and other mammals. It's what keeps us alive, governing vital functions like heart rate, respiration, digestion, and blood pressure. Things that happen without having to think about them.
The next level up, the first floor, more evolved. Hundreds of thousands of years later, it's called the limbic system. And this is very important in the processing of emotions.
Within the limbic system are the amygdala, 2 nuggets of tissue, one in each half of the brain. They are no bigger than a fingernail, yet they are the brain's central command center for our emotional reactions. One of the simplest and strongest of these is fear, a primal emotion we all share.
If you had to pick one brain region that was most important in fear, it would be the amygdala.
What scientists discovered is that as humans evolved, another part of the brain, called the cortex, also became involved in processing fear.
The part that makes us most human about the brain is our frontal cortex.
If the amygdala is the first floor, the cortex is the second floor of the brain. It's the brain's thin, wrinkly outer layer that's divided into 4 sets of lobes.
If you unfolded the cortex of a monkey, it would be about the size of a piece of paper. If you unfolded our cortex, it's about 4 sheets of paper large. And the reason it's wrinkly is because you have to squish that all inside of the skull.
The frontal lobes comprise the area just above our eyes, and these are the newest rooms of the brain. As humans evolved, the frontal lobes became the place where conscious, rational thought is processed. It's where we do our problem solving.
The frontal lobes are so interesting because they are really the conductor of the brain. They synchronize all activity
Scientists made a major breakthrough in fear research when they found that information from our senses reaches the amygdala almost twice as fast as it takes to get to our frontal lobes. The speed of the different brain signals means unless we instinctively know how to react to a potential threat, we may freeze in fear, waiting for the frontal lobes to catch up to figure out the right response.
Part of what happens with fear and panic is the unknown, is not knowing what to do next, and so your brain essentially freezes the way a deer freezes in the headlight.
So the amygdala may get very fast signals about fear, but sometimes they're wrong, and quickly the situation may say to you, no, it's not a fear situation, and you're not afraid. So these very quick amygdala signals that you get can be controlled in sort of a top-down way.
Okay, the last part was cut off. Basically, what she's saying is that these fear signals in the amygdala can be controlled in a top-down way. Top-down way means using the thinking brain, the frontal lobe, to control the amygdala, right? So the part of the brain that is responsible for your happiness is the frontal lobe, the thinking brain, right? So the amygdala is the part of the brain that is responsible for your suffering, the emotional reactions. So the cerebral cortex, the outermost layer of the brain, is made of 4 lobes. You have the parietal lobe over the top, you have the occipital lobe at the back, you have the temporal lobes on the side, and finally you have the frontal lobe in the front here, behind the forehead. And the frontal lobe is responsible for a number of very important functions, which are responsible for your happiness. Right? Attention system, long-term memory, logic, critical thinking, lateral thinking, imagination, decision-making, planning, goal-setting, judgment, reasoning, and rationalizing. But the functions that is most responsible for your happiness is those last 2. Decision-making, goal-setting, planning, judgment, reasoning, rationalizing. If you make good decisions to do something useful in your life, it will lead to your happiness. If you start to set good goals, wholesome goals, it will lead to your happiness. If you begin to plan your actions and able to execute your actions and bring a lot of good fortunes and a lot of good outcomes in your life, that will lead to your happiness. If you're able to judge what is right from wrong, good from bad, wholesome from unwholesome, useful from useless, if you're able to make judgment like that, then you will be able to choose what is good for you and what is not good for you. That will lead to your happiness. If you're able to reason out how you can help yourself to be a better person, what are the causes and conditions that lead to certain outcomes, why doing A leads to B, doing B leads to C, causes and conditions leading to outcomes, then you will know what you should avoid and what you should focus on, and that will lead to your happiness. And finally, you're able to rationalize how you can manage your life and how you can be a better person. All these will lead to your happiness. So the part of the brain responsible for your happiness, if you make good use of it, is that little bit in the prefrontal cortex, called the prefrontal cortex. It's that little bit right behind the eyebrow. See, the frontal lobe is the whole thing behind your forehead. At the bottom of that little bit right behind your eyebrow is called the prefrontal cortex. And this is the part of the brain that is most responsible for your happiness. So if you talk about suffering and happiness, it is really a battle between amygdala and prefrontal cortex. Now, what happens when we cultivate our mind? When we meditate, we're doing 2 things. First, we are taming the emotional reaction, taming the chitta. We are taming the amygdala so that the amygdala does not react easily, bringing the amygdala to a state of stillness and peace. At the same time, we're sharpening the prefrontal cortex. Sharpening the prefrontal cortex through the process of sustained, focused, conscious attention. Because when you meditate, that is what you're doing. You are placing sustained, focused, conscious attention on a specific thing that's going on an activity in the body. You're breathing, or you are analyzing your thoughts, or rather analyzing basically the realities of life, contemplating the realities of life. So all these are rational, critical thinking. You're sharpening the prefrontal cortex. So when you meditate, two things will happen in your brain. Dulling and taming of the amygdala, and sharpening and brightening of your prefrontal cortex. And that will lead to your happiness. In fact, I have another talk series elsewhere I call How Meditation Changes the Brain, where I actually explain what happens to the brain when you meditate. So for some of you, it is in the YouTube, so you can Google it and look it up and take a look at what I spoke about, how meditation changes the brain. Talking about when you meditate, you're sharpening the prefrontal cortex, at the same time calming and taming your amygdala. So this is the other word you have to recognize and pay attention to, prefrontal cortex. So far I've been talking mostly about the brain. Now let's talk about the mind. What did the Buddha say about the mind? Amazingly, all these explanations that I've given you about the brain, based on what the scientists have come up with, the Buddha has described the mind in such a way that they actually support exactly what the scientists have discovered about the brain. The activity of the brain is the mind. So the Buddha described the mind as an activity, and an activity can only be experienced. An activity cannot be seen, heard, smelled, tasted, and touched. It cannot be held. It doesn't exist, but it can be experienced. So the Buddha spoke about the mind having three kinds of mental experiences. He used three words to describe the mind. First, he called vijnana. Vijnana is the process where you are aware of what you have seen, heard, smelled, tasted, and touched as a result of the panchakanda. And this is perception. Having a perception. So that is vijnana. Then the second word the Buddha used to describe the mind is mano, the thinking mind, the intellect. The thinking part of the mind where you begin to interpret and give meaning to what you have seen, heard, smelled, taste, and touch. That is what the mano does. Conception. We spoke about this at the last forum. Right? Cognitive process. The third word the Buddha used to describe the mind is chitta. Right? And chitta is the affective process, the emotion. And basically there are two things happening with chitta. First, the chitta reacts to whether the sensation is pleasant or unpleasant. If it is pleasant, it causes a certain kind of reaction. If it is unpleasant, it causes another kind of reaction. So that is what happens in the chitta. And the second thing that is happening with the chitta is that with every experience, you begin to personalize your experience. For an untrained mind, we personalize experience. So this process of personalizing an experience is upadana, clinging, right? Grasping, attachment. But Bhante Punnaji calls this personalization. And with this personalization, you begin to think there is a self being affected by the feelings, by Vedana. When it's pleasant or unpleasant, you think that there is a self that is affected by it. That is the subjective experience. Right? And with that thinking, you begin to think that, oh, this body that is experiencing this sensation, this body is me, I, the self, right? And that is the thing that is happening that is called Sakkaya Ditthi. I'll talk about that in the next sharing. So let's focus very much on emotions. Right? One thing I want to, actually there are two things I want to point out. First, when you read a lot of English translations, unfortunately, many translators, when they see the word mano, they say mind. When they see the word chitta, they say mind. They don't differentiate. So when you read many English translations in sutras, you will come across the word mind. But actually behind the English word mind is the Pali word. It is either chitta or mano. And Buddha was very precise when he used mano or chitta to mean specifically what aspect of the mind. Is it the conscious, rational aspect of the mind, or is it the emotional, unconscious aspect of the mind? The Buddha was very precise. So it is an unfortunate thing that most translators translate mano as mind, chitta as mind. So they don't differentiate Because during the time when these early translators started translating, they did not really understand the science of the mind, that the mind comes with these two kinds of thoughts. The rational, conscious thoughts, which is our thinking, our intellect, and the unconscious emotional thoughts, which is really our emotion. And the second thing I want to point out is that the word chitta is commonly used to describe mind as a whole, generally. So, in some sutras, especially when mano is mentioned, then the Buddha was referring specifically to the thinking mind. And then in most cases, when chitta is mentioned, Buddha was referring to the emotional mind. But generally, when Buddha was referring to mind in general, then he used the word chitta. So chitta is used in two ways. One, to describe the emotional mind. The other is a general term to describe mind as a whole, right? But most of the teachings of the Buddha, and I have looked at various Pali texts that talks about this thing called mind. Buddha was very specific when he talked about mano or when he talked about chitta. He actually referred to whether it is the rational, conscious thinking or intellect, or our unconscious emotional thinking, right, which is the emotions. Right? So it's either mano or chitta. So in that part of the book on page 53, Bhante Punnaji has pointed out that it is this subjective experience, right? And basically he mentioned here also that the Buddha described the mind with these three words. How did they correlate with the activity of the brain? Now I'm going to show you how these three aspects of mind correlate to the activity of the brain. Now if we look at the brain, when we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch anything, light enters the eye, sound enters the ear, and they stimulate the sense organ, and the sense organ sends signals to the brain. These signals come through the peripheral nervous system, through the spinal cord, and enters the brain. It enters the brain through the brainstem. So you could say that the brainstem is the part of the brain that is carrying the signals of sensations, sanya, and feeling, vedana, into the brain to be processed, right? And this is processed into vijnana, perception. So you could say that part of the brain is responsible for carrying the information from your sense organs into the brain to be processed as perception, vijnana. And then the outermost part of your brain, your thinking brain, generally, now it's not exactly one-to-one relationship, but generally the outermost part of your brain is responsible for your conscious thinking. And that conscious thinking is your cognitive process, your rational conscious thinking, cognitive process, or your intellect. This is mano. And then in the middle part of your brain, that is responsible for reacting to feelings that are pleasant or unpleasant, that is really the reaction. The activity of this reaction is chitta, right? The affective process, the emotional part of the mind. Right? So that is why it's called the emotional brain. Right? So I hope you now understand the loose correlation. Right? It's not exact, but it is loosely. And I hope from this you will also be able to appreciate that modern science is only beginning to discover what the Buddha was talking about 2,600 years ago. Until very recently, scientists could not agree on what makes up the mind. It's only now that they're beginning to appreciate, and many groups of them start to have some kind of, well, I wouldn't say consensus, but some kind of a common agreement, what is the mind. But the Buddha was very wise. He was very specific and very clear when he used those three terms, vijnana, mano, and chitta, to describe the mind. So now let's go back to this process of experience and look at it one more time. Now we look at it as the activity of the mind. So what is going on? Activities in the environment stimulate our sense organ, And that gives rise to seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching because of the Panchakanda. And now we have a perception. The perception of what we have seen, heard, smelled, tasted, and touched through our sense organs. And then we begin to interpret. The mano begin to interpret by this process called papancha, right? Referring to categorized memory of past experience and try to give meaning to it. This process is answering that question, what is this? There are two questions that arise in your mind the moment you see, hear, smell, taste, or touch anything. The first one is, what is this? So this is the cognitive process. Mano is answering the question, what is this? So it's able to recognize or recognize what you have just seen, heard, smelled, taste, and touch. So this is really the process of Panchakanda, and it is Sanya that triggers the activity of Mano. Sanya is the sensation. When light enters the eye, it triggers light sensitive cell, it sends a signal to the brain, and that whole activity is actually the beginning of this Mano, the cognitive process. The feeling, the Vedana, is sending these sensations, whether it is pleasant or unpleasant, irritating your nervous system or soothing your nervous system. We spoke about that during the first forum, the first session of forum, that it either irritates your nervous system or soothes your nervous system, and that is Vedana, is pleasant or unpleasant, based on what you have seen, heard, smelled, taste, and touch. Now, I want to point out very importantly is that Chitta arises, reacts at two levels. First, it reacts to the sensation, whether it is pleasant, unpleasant, reacting to Vedana. So here it is reacting to Vedana. This pleasant or unpleasant sensation is not emotional. A lot of people think, or some people describe Vedana as an emotional feeling. It is not. This is not emotion, but this triggers emotion. See the difference? It causes the arising of emotion. Itself, Vedana is not an emotional reaction. It is basically whether it irritates your nervous system or it soothes your nervous system, as I pointed out before. High-pitched sound, very loud sound, irritates your ear, irritates your nervous system. Soothing, soft tones, soft sound, right? Low-pitched, soft sound soothes your nervous system, soothes your hearing, makes you feel comfortable. That is Vedana, right? It has nothing to do with whether you like it or don't like it. And as I pointed out before, some kids, they love loud music. So that loving loud music is not Vedana. That is an emotional reaction. The fact that loud music irritates your hearing system, that irritation, that is the unpleasant irritation of Vedana. So Vedana is not an emotional reaction. So at this point in time, this Vedana is really the sensations, whether it is pleasant or unpleasant. And that arouses Chitta. Right? So Chitta reacts to this pleasant or unpleasant sensation. So this is the beginning of emotion. Right? This is not emotion, but the beginning of emotion. It triggers a chain reaction called emotion. So what does it trigger? Emotions come in two dimensions. As I pointed out, first there is a physiological dimension, and then there is a psychological dimension. Physiological dimension has something to do with the body, how the body reacts to it. And that is physical suffering, dukkha. Psychological reaction is how the mind, right, the activity of the mind, how the mind perceives it and reacts to it, and that is mental suffering, domanassa. So there's two kinds of activity going on that collectively is called emotions. At the same time, emotions have two kinds of activities: arousal and reaction. Arousal is whether the Vedana is pleasant or unpleasant. Reaction is whether you like or you dislike. This is emotional reaction. So in other words, emotional reaction is tanha, not Vedana. Vedana is whether the sensation is pleasant or unpleasant. But when you begin to like it or don't like it and react to it, that is tanha. So we're going to talk a little bit about tanha from a scientific perspective. Unfortunately, the word tanha is always translated as craving, and that is in a way misleading. You always think of craving as something you want, but what about it is something unpleasant? Do you want more of it? You don't, So the real, a more precise scientific translation of the word tanha is what Bhante Punnaji offered us: emotional reaction. Right? So we'll come to that in a moment. So now, when chitta reacts to Vedana, whether it is pleasant or unpleasant, it actually triggers a release of biochemical reactions in the body. Right? Biochemical reactions in the body causes tensions in the body. These tensions in the body is stressful, physically stressful, because this biochemical reaction in the body is very uncomfortable. It makes the body feel uncomfortable, and this is a kind of physical suffering. So this is really the physical suffering called dukkha. So the biochemical activity is that physical suffering. Physiological disturbance, which then I call stress. Stress here, I'm using it to mean that physical suffering. Fight, flight, or freeze reaction. Right? So let's take a look at what the scientists have to say about stress.
Fear is so important for our survival, we do something absolutely remarkable. Our bodies begin to react to a threat before we're even consciously aware of what the threat might be. Because when we're faced with danger, milliseconds count. At the first hint of danger, early warning signals are sent to the brain via the optic nerve to our tiny and primitive fear center, the amygdala. This prepares our body for action. Next, nerve pulses are fired down the spinal cord to the adrenal glands near our kidneys. This triggers a release of adrenaline. Now we're on full alert. Adrenaline is the vital hormone that can flood our body in a split second. As it reaches our lungs, we breathe more deeply and take in more oxygen. It also makes our heart beat faster. Oxygen-rich blood is diverted to our muscles. They are now charged springs, waiting for the signal to run or fight. All this before our conscious mind has even registered a threat. This reaction to fear has evolved over millions of years and is known as the fight or flight response.
So you heard the scientists say that it causes changes in the body. So what kind of changes? First, whenever you see, hear, smell, taste, or touch anything, the brain sends a signal down the spinal cord through what is termed as the sympathetic nervous system. And then it causes various reactions in different parts of the body. One of the things it does is that it sends a signal, sends a message to your glands, and the glands, and the most important gland that is being affected in this process is the adrenal gland. Adrenal gland is located above your kidney. So you have two kidneys, there are two adrenal glands. When the adrenal gland is aroused, it reacts by releasing two hormones. First, it releases adrenaline, and then it releases cortisol. Actually, there are also other minor hormones being associated with it. But I'm pointing out at the two major hormones. So it releases two major hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. So what does adrenaline and cortisol do? It causes your heart to beat faster. It increases your blood pressure so that you can pump more blood throughout your body. It actually causes your respiration to speed up so that you can draw in more oxygen, because oxygen is needed by the cells as energy to react to any threats. So all these are evolved to help you protect your body. And then it causes other things like your digestive system to be suspended. It causes your muscles to be all tensed up. Then your muscles get tensed up. It causes your hairs to stand on end. So, when your hair stands on end, it is commonly called goosebumps, goose pimple. that sensation. Ooh, you feel that tingling sensation. So that is actually goose pimples or goosebump. And it causes your pupils to dilate. In other words, open up to try to catch more light, to see more clearly what is threatening you. And it causes your facial expression to distort. This distortion of facial expression is actually a reaction that has evolved over millions of years. In ancient times, or even before humans were evolved, when we were primitive organisms, this is actually used to frighten away predators. You see, when smaller animals are threatened, they react in such a way and make themselves look big to frighten away predators. And it also causes other reactions, perspiration, trembling, and so on. Right? So you can see what are some of the reactions here. Hair standing on end, pupils dilate, facial expression distorted, muscles all tensed up. Right? So these are the reactions. And it also does other thing. It actually causes an increase in blood sugar level, and it suspends your body immune system. It increases blood sugar level in order to speed up metabolism so that you can now convert stored energy into active energy to fight against the threat. And if you look at all these things, they are very, very unhealthy. If your body immune system is suspended, you get sick easily. If your blood sugar level rises, you become diabetic. This is very unhealthy. And this is physical suffering, dukkha, stress. And this stress, you have to be careful. Now your body is stressed. This bodily stress is a kind of bodily sensations. And now these bodily sensations, your bodily stress, your bodily sensation is now arousing the chitta in the second way. I pointed out to you, the chitta is aroused in two ways. One is by Vedana, whether what you have seen, heard, smell, taste, and touch is pleasant or unpleasant. The second one is, whatever happens, if there is biochemical reactions in the body and you start to feel these bodily sensations, it will arouse the chitta the second time. And it is this second arousal which is actually leads to a lot of very bad emotional thoughts. Because it is this second arousal that triggers the arising of memory, imagination, expectation. And this leads to three conditions: lobha, dosa, moha. I'll explain the connections later. This arising in the mind, this is the mental or psychological distress, psychological disturbance that is going on. This emotional excitement is a psychological disturbance. This disturbance leads to mental proliferation. That means the mind begins to wander off, thinking all kinds of bad thoughts. Right? And that can disturb your thinking mind. And when that happens, you can't think rationally anymore. In other words, when we get emotional, our emotional mind takes control. And we cannot think rationally anymore. So this disturbance is domanassa. This is the mental suffering, distress, I call it. Right? So I call the physical suffering, dukkha, as stress, the mental suffering, domanassa, as distress. You will find a different translation by many translators, especially Bhikkhu Bodhi. He actually refers that as fever. You will find in some sutras, the Buddha described that if you are upset or angry, you will experience fever. Now, the Buddha was not talking about someone, having high temperature and all that. That's not what the Buddha meant. The word fever was the Buddha's way of describing to the lay people that your body is now changing. Right? So, in other words, fever is this physiological changes in your body. But the Buddha could not say to the people at the, 2,600 years ago, what kind of people was the Buddha talking to? Peasants, farmers, fishermen, right? These people are not educated. Most of them are not educated. Very handful are educated. Most of them are not educated. If you try to explain to them what is a hormone, they won't understand in those days. So the Buddha used the word fever, right? Or something that meant fever. And that is changes in the body. And then you will find Bhikkhu Bodhi translating that distress as vexation. So vexation When you see the word vexation in Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, you will realize what Bhikkhu Bodhi was referring to is this mental suffering, vexation. So he calls fever and vexation. Physical suffering, stress, dukkha, or mental suffering, distress, domanassa. Right? Be aware of that, so that when you read the translated sutras, especially the ones translated by Bhikkhu Bodhi, and you see the word fever, don't think that the Buddha was talking about a person experiencing fever. The Buddha was actually talking about the person experiencing hormonal changes in the body. That's why he used the word fever. See, the Buddha was very wise. He could not use word like hormone because people don't understand that. But when he says fever, people understand, right? And this is sort of like a fever. Now, I mentioned to you the mind has two kinds of thoughts when it sees, hears, smell, taste, or touch anything. The first one was, what is this? The second one is, how does this affect me? And this is where the personalization of experience comes in. This is where we begin to have this notion there is a I, me, and mine being affected by these feelings. Right? So this is the part which causes us to personalize the experience, which causes us to have this notion that there is a body and a self that is being affected by feelings, subjective feelings. Right? And this is when the mind goes into mental proliferation. How does this affect me? Now, if you think about it, every time you see, hear, smell, taste, or touch something, and you want to consider how does that affect you, gosh, there's 1,000,001 ways how anything you see, hear, smell, taste, and touch can affect you. There is no end to that thinking, right? So that's why it's called mental proliferation. The mind wanders off. And when it does that, the mind is no longer calm. It is pulling in opposite direction. This pulling in opposite direction is actually called vichikicha, cognitive dissonance. Vichikicha is translated as doubt, but actually what is really going on is a battle between your emotion and your thinking. Your rational thinking and your emotional thinking are pulling in opposite direction. That is really vichikicha, right? And that causes you to react in such a way that you do not follow what you really know. Take, for example, the 5 precepts, right? The very first precept, panatipata. Right? We don't want to harm or kill living things. And then we sleep at night, and then this mosquito come to your ear, and you try to chase it away. Second time it comes, you chase it away. Third time, fourth time, fifth time, sixth time, seventh time, eighth time, ninth time, and then you see? Now you know you have taken the first precept. Knowing is the mano. Realizing I should not kill. But you feel so angry with this mosquito that doesn't want to go away, and then you react. That reaction is your feeling. You want to get rid of the mosquito, and when you try to push it away, it won't go away. It keeps coming back. You finally have no choice. You take that action. Right? That is vichikicha in action. You know it is wrong, and yet you do it. Because you're doing it based on how you feel. Why? 99 times out of 100, every action we take is taken based on how we feel, not based on what we know. Because in the mind, that battle between knowing what is good for us and feeling what is nice and pleasurable for us, they are pulling in opposite direction. And almost every time, feeling wins. Emotion wins. How many of you agree or disagree? Right? When you have this battle going on, your emotion is pulling in one direction and your thinking, rational thoughts is pulling in the other direction. Which one wins? Emotion wins most of the time. But don't blame yourself. Why? It is the way the brain has evolved. Very importantly. If we don't train our mind, the way the brain has evolved will lead to emotions winning every time because of the way the brain has evolved. So I'm going to show you why the scientists have pointed out. This is the tug of war that's going on between feeling and thinking. Vichikicha or cognitive dissonance.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, time!
And when we try to control them, we start a tug of war between our brain's oldest and newest parts. While ancient structures like the amygdala respond to threats by trying to turn our anger or fear on, it's newer structures, such as the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of our brain, that try to turn them off. It's the tug of war between these two systems that gives rise to our emotions. At New York University, neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux has studied how the amygdala and the cortex shape our emotional responses. You know more about the amygdala than anybody alive, and you still can't control yours.
No.
Why?
Now, there's an interesting thing, again, that has to do with the wiring of the brain. This is if we could just look at it here. So this is the human brain inside a skull. And the prefrontal cortex is here in the front, right behind your forehead. And that is the newest part of the brain. This is where we make our decisions. This is where we plan for the future and strategize. The lateral prefrontal cortex has no connectivity with the amygdala. The amygdala has superhighways to talk to the cortex, but the prefrontal cortex has only back roads and side streets to get to the amygdala. And therefore, it is unable to tell the amygdala, cool it.
But why are there no connections?
We're in the process of evolving as we speak, and those connections have not been put in yet. This thing was built to do fancy things cognitively, not necessarily to control our emotions.
So the way our brain has evolved over millions of years is that the amygdala has very strong connections going to the thinking brain. And yet the thinking brain has very weak connections going back to the amygdala. Which means when the amygdala is aroused and it's active, it is sending a lot of sabotaging messages to the thinking brain, disturbing your thinking. While at the same time, when you're using your rational thinking, because it's being disturbed, now you want to try to calm the amygdala, but the connections between your thinking brain and the amygdala is very weak. You cannot control the amygdala. You cannot tame the amygdala. You cannot calm the amygdala so easily. Right? That's why when the thinking brain and the emotional brain are fighting, the emotional brain will win all the time, because the connections from the amygdala going to your thinking brain are so strong that it drowns out and disturbs your thinking, that you cannot think rationally. So it's very important to realize this is really what is going on, and this is causing us to become normally emotional. And the only way to overcome that is to train the mind through use of meditation. Meditation is one of the most powerful and most effective way to train your mind so that you can actually calm the emotional part of the mind, at the same time sharpen up the rational thinking part of the mind. Right? So attending meditation retreats frequently helps a lot. So for those of you who haven't done it, put it in your agenda. And Bhante Punnaji is actually going to be conducting one at the end of the year in the middle of December. I'll send out the information about the dates in due course. So mark your calendar and join in Bhante Punnaji's meditation retreat. You will learn something interesting in there. Because Bhante Punnaji's meditation retreat is quite different from what you find in other people's meditation retreat. The first thing Bhante will teach you is how to relax. So important. Learning how to relax is so important to help to calm the amygdala. And at the same time, that relaxation in the body will help you sharpen your thinking. So calming the amygdala, calming the emotional mind, and sharpening and brightening your thinking mind is so important. Right? So that's so much about emotions. We more or less covered the bulk of emotions. Then let's take a look at one step further. Right? We take a look at this thing called sankhara, and this is found on page 119. There are three kinds of sankhara. The first kind of sankhara is actually called chitta sankhara, and this is actually found in the Panchakanda. The sankhara in the Panchakanda is the chitta sankhara. It is actually constructing Vedana and Sanya. That sankhara is constructing Vedana and Sanya to produce the big picture called Vijnana. We already spoke about that during the first session. So that is Chitta Sankara, constructing our perception. Right? The big picture. Vijnana is the big picture of what you see, made up all the objects that you can see. All right. So that is Chitta Sankara. There is another kind of Sankara called Vachi Sankara. Verbal construction. Verbal construction, a lot of people misinterpret it as speech. No. It's not talking about the words you say. Vachi Sankara is actually constructing questions and answers in your mind, thoughts. It's actually, the speech in the mind, not the speech of your mouth. It is the speech in your mind, Vachi Sankara. And it is actually constructing Vitakka Vichara. Vichara is, Bhante has pointed out, and we discussed this in the last forum. Vichara means inquiry. Vitakka means inference. So this is constantly going on. The mind, whenever we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch anything, it is constantly experiencing Vichara Vitakka, Vichara Vitakka. What is this? And then we try to answer. How does it affect me? And then it answers. So, as I pointed out to you, there are two kinds of questions that arise as soon as we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch something. The first is, what is this? The second one is, how does it affect me? So this is the thing that is going on in the mind. And that is Vachi Sankara, the construction of Vitakka Vichara. The third kind is actually Kaya Sankara. And this has to do with your respiration, producing energy that is feeding the brain. Now, I asked Bhante before, but Bhante never really explained it very explicitly. So I'm expressing to you what I think I heard. I may be wrong. So we're going to have to clarify with Bhante when he comes back. What is Kaya Sankara? What I have understood from the explanation Bhante gave me was that Kaya Sankara is this process of respiration that takes energy from the surrounding and converts it and feeds this energy to the brain, causing this mental process. Right? This is not the process of keeping you alive. This is the process of keeping your brain active. Because this Kaya Sankara is related to the activity of the mind. All three of them are related to the activity of the mind. There is a fourth kind of Sankara not commonly mentioned, and that is keeping the body alive, and that has nothing to do with the mind. And that is called Ayu Sankara. Ayu Sankara is the process of metabolism, right? Converting energy from the environment to keep the cells multiplying, keeping the body alive, metabolism. Right? That is Ayu Sankara, not commonly described. Then I asked Bhante, why the Buddha never included Ayu Sankara as the fourth kind of Sankara? It's simple. Ayu Sankara has nothing to do with the mind. That's it. These three kinds of Sankara has everything to do with the mind. So this is a mind-related thing. Whenever the Buddha spoke of Sankara, it was relating to the activity of the mind. Right? So Ayu Sankara has nothing to do with the mind. It is the respiration. And to go one step further, some of you may have attended one of the Q&A forum where Bhante was talking about meditation into the Arupa Samadhi, where the mind actually comes to, the mind actually stops, but the body is still alive. So that means all Sankara, all three kinds of Sankara has stopped. No more. But Ayu Sankara is still going on. Because Ayu Sankara is necessary to keep the body alive. Right? So that is really the clarification there. So these three kinds of Sankara pertains to the Sankara that relates to how the mind works. And Ayu Sankara is really basically keeping the body alive. So today, what we have covered with emotional thoughts is really this middle one. Right? Vachi Sankara, verbal construction. The thoughts that arise in the mind in the form of Vichara Vitakka, Vichara Vitakka, Vichara Vitakka, constantly doing that. And this will lead us to two kinds of thoughts. Good thoughts and bad thoughts, wholesome thoughts and unwholesome thoughts. Thoughts that lead to happiness and thoughts that lead to suffering. And the Buddha very clearly explained this, and this is also found in level 1 book. Right? This level 1 book, right? Not the level 3, but level 1 book, where it is called the Veda Vitaka Sutra, Majjhima Nikaya, right? Veda Vitaka Sutra, two kinds of thoughts. And I'll just point you to one particular section in based on Bhante's translation here. It says that when we have two kinds of thoughts, of course we should choose good thoughts, but at the same time, if we allow thoughts to go on, excessive thinking, right? This excessive thinking is called mental proliferation. Excessive thinking and pondering will tire the mind, right? When you think too much, it tires the mind, and you can no longer think rationally. And when the mind and the body are tired, then you can no longer think rationally. This was very clearly mentioned. So this is a very important point brought up by the Buddha, that overthinking can cause you to make wrong decisions or bad decisions. So in this, now I took this particular translation from Bhikkhu Bodhi now. Right? There are two kinds of thoughts: wholesome thoughts, unwholesome thoughts. And of course we should choose wholesome thoughts. But at the same time, if we allow the mind to ponder too much, excessive thinking leads to mental proliferation. Mental proliferation will lead to fear, panic, anxiety, frustration, anger, stress, and suffering. So be aware, don't overthink, right? So just choose what is wholesome and good, and that's it. Don't try to rationalize too much, thinking too much. It's also what the Buddha pointed out, those four things you should avoid thinking about, right? And one of them is the working of how the results of karma, how they come to be, right? How the results of karma arise. Thinking too much of that will drive you crazy. The other three, I can't remember, but one of them is to think of how the world began, the beginning of the world. To try to figure out how the world began, that will drive you crazy also. Another one we should not think about is, what can the Buddha do? The powers of the Buddha, the capabilities of the Buddha, right? So those are the four things. That is actually in the Anguttara Nikaya, Book of Force. I think it is Sutra number 77, if I'm not mistaken. I may be wrong, but somewhere in the 70s you will find, right, that particular sutra. Four things you should not overthink. This is also for this reason. This is why this is my personal comment, my personal belief. When people start to teach Buddhism to other people, we should not spend too much time talking about karma and rebirth. Simply because we don't know how karma really works, how rebirth really works. So trying to think about that can drive us crazy, right? That is just a personal opinion. Huh? So we go back to the beginning of the Buddha's teaching in order to understand further about this thing called tanha. And in the very first sutra, right, the Dhamma Cakkappavattana Sutra, the first sermon, setting into motion the wheel of Dhamma, the Buddha pointed out there are four aspects of suffering. Dukkha, there is suffering. Samudaya, there is the origin of suffering. Nirodha, there is the end of suffering or cessation of suffering. And Magga, there is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. We focus on the very first one, the first noble truth. There is suffering, dukkha. And there are basically eight aspects of dukkha. The first four are birth, aging, sickness, and death. These are the first four. Pretty common sense. The next four, what are they? Number 5 is separation from what is pleasing is suffering. That means if you have experienced something pleasurable, you have experienced something you enjoy, you like very much, now you can no longer have it. That is suffering, isn't it? If it is a kind of food you love to eat and you can no longer eat it, that is suffering. For those of you who love to eat durian, if suddenly the Ministry of Health announced that the entire durian population in the whole of this country, in the whole world, has been destroyed by some kind of disease, we can no longer have durian in this world, how would you feel? Okay? So being separated from something pleasing. Here, the Buddha was referring to something you have experienced before. Pleasurable experiences. Now you no longer have it. Now, next one is to be with what is displeasing. Again, this is what you have experienced. If you have experienced something that you don't want, you don't like, you hate, that upsets you, that makes you angry, and you continue to get it, how does that make you feel? Huh? For example, let's say you have a neighbor who keeps throwing rubbish in your backyard and keeps playing music, very loud music until late at night, and you're so angry, you really don't like, and you decide to move away. Oh, you bought a new house in another town, so you move to the other town, and this is a brand new area. The next lot, somebody else bought it. Then they move in. Who do you think moved in? Your old neighbor. How would you feel? Right? Something that you wanted to get away from now comes back to you. To be with what is displeasing, that is suffering. Number 7, not to get what you wish for or what you want. That means you have a desire, a wish, something you haven't quite accomplished yet, something you haven't gotten yet, but you wish to get it. You wish to get a promotion in your job. You wish, for someone who's single, you wish to get married, find the right person and then settle down and get married. But you can't get what you wish for. Right? Isn't that suffering? You wish for something but you can never get. But all these 7 pale in comparison to the 8th kind of suffering. The 8th kind of suffering is basically the 5 aggregates subject to clinging. That means when we begin to cling on to the experience of the 5 aggregate, that is the biggest kind of suffering. Because that kind of suffering really leads us to very deep suffering. Right? If we continue to cling on to the experience of the 5 aggregate. So when we talk about being separated from what is pleasing, that is simply means we regret that pleasurable experience from past have ended. And this is because of our memory. When we talk about to be with what we don't want, what we find displeasing, this is really the fearful, painful experiences will keep coming back. And this is unfounded fear, imagination. Right, from our imagination that, oh, I'm going to keep getting this back. And when we talk about not getting what we want, what you want is some kind of an expectations. Now you failed in your expectation, dissatisfied, that desires are not fulfilled, and this is from your expectations. But the 4th one, most importantly, when you begin to personalize the experience, upadana, personalize the body as the self, being affected by Vedana, right? Subjective feelings, subjective experience. And this will lead to the notion, you think that there is this self, this body is the self, and the self is me, the I, me, and mine. This will lead to ignorance and delusion, and this will cause you suffering to no end. Right? It is not something you can easily get rid of once you get into this state of suffering. So you got to learn not to cling on, crave for whatever you see, hear, smell, taste, or touch. Very importantly. Because every time we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch, first thought arises is, what is this? But the second thought that arises, how does this affect me? And if we allow this kind of thoughts arise, it brings a lot of suffering. Right? Human beings are the only species of animal that regrets the past, fearful of the future, and never satisfied with the present moment. That's why we got suffering. Because every time we think about the past, we regret. Every time we think about the future, we are fearful. And every time we look around us, we don't appreciate what we get, and then we get dissatisfied. Nothing is ever satisfactory. So that is really what suffering is all about. The cause of suffering, samudaya, origin of suffering. Right? Here, the Buddha pointed out, now I'm using Bhikkhu Bodhi translation because Bhante Punnaji did not actually provide a translation for this. But I'm using Bhikkhu Bodhi translation. It says that it is this craving which leads to renewed existence. Craving here is tanha. It is this tanha which leads to renewed existence, accompanied by delight and lust, seeking delight here and there. In other words, when we suffer, when we get angry or upset or we are not happy, we always want to look for something pleasurable to drown our sorrows. This is what we do, drown our sorrows. And some people resort to drinking alcohol to drown their sorrows. Some people resort to watching soap opera. Some people resort to eating a lot of food to drown their sorrows. Well, I used to have a joke, you see. Whenever I am unhappy, I drown my sorrows in food. Whenever I am very happy, I have a great appetite. So I call this win-win. Win-win ma. Both also win ma. So this is what it is. We seek pleasures and delight to overcome the suffering. And then there is this craving for sensual pleasures. And then there is this craving for non-existence. And there is this craving for continued existence. Now, what did the Buddha mean here? A lot of people will find this difficult, but actually what the Buddha really meant is very simple. Craving for sensual pleasures is lobha, lust and greed for pleasures. Craving for non-existence, actually it is something you don't want, you want to get rid of. That is dosa, aversion or hatred. Aversion and hatred towards these pleasures. Now here I want to point out, lust turns into greed. What is lust? If it is something pleasurable, you want it. That is lust. But when you start to get what you want, what is it next? You want more. Greed. So lust turns to greed. When it is something unpleasant, aversion turns to hatred. Aversion means avoiding. Get rid of. Stay away. So when you try to get rid of something you don't like, and it keeps coming back, how do you feel towards it? You hate it. So aversion turns into hatred. So this is lobha and dosa. And now comes the tricky one. A lot of people find this third one difficult. Craving for continued existence. This is really moha. So what is moha? Moha is really the delusion of a self-centered existence. I, me, and mine. Right? This feeling of I, me, and mine. Now today we're not going to go into this. Next session we're going to talk about this. Next session, next forum, we will talk about upadana and also sakaya ditti. And that is where this I, me, and mine, right, in the body, we can begin to understand it from a scientific perspective. So we're going to finish it today very quickly by summing up that this word craving is really the word tanha. And Bhante Punnaji pointed out very clearly. Tanha, a more precise and accurate translation, is emotional reaction. And this is the thing I really love about Bhante. He's very good with choosing the right word. Tanha is really emotional reaction to sensation that is pleasant, sensation that is unpleasant, sensation that is neither pleasant nor unpleasant. Right? So when you have these three kinds of sensation, it leads to three kinds of reaction. Right? So, and these three kinds of unwholesome roots of reaction is called akusala mula. Three unwholesome roots or three unwholesome tanhas. The first one, if it is something pleasurable, we lust and greed for it. This is called kama tanha, the craving for sensual pleasures. And then if it is something unpleasant, we want to get rid of it, we want to avoid it. This is dosa. And this is vibhava tanha. Craving for non-existence, meaning you wish that it never existed. You don't want it to exist, you want to get rid of it. Right? So this is vibhava tanha. And the third one, when it is neutral sensations, you begin to have this delusion of self-centered existence, moha. This is bhava tanha, craving for continued existence. Basically, this is that when it is a neutral sensation, you begin to feel as though you exist. Something exists out there, and they say, let it be, let it continue to exist. So this is the craving for continued existence. So these are the three kinds of tanha. So we'll finish off with the last couple of slides. Bhante has pointed out that it is the affective process that becomes conscious of a self and gets involved with an emotional relationship between the self and the world. You see, when we see something, we think it's something out there. That is the objective experience. At the same time, we feel the feeling, pleasant and unpleasant. And then we begin to feel this subjective experience. The subjective experience is the atta. The objective experience is the loka, the world. Right? And this is how we begin to separate that experience and come with the idea that there is a world out there and there is me in here. I am feeling and experiencing the world out there. That's I and the world, the atta and the loka, become two separated. The subjective experience, the objective experience. So next sharing, we're going to go into that a bit more detail. So I'm not going to go further as far as this separation, this Sakkaya Ditthi is concerned. Okay. So in summary, we have covered basically all the points I mentioned there, and leaving the last 2 points for our next sharing. So thank you very much, Bhante, for your time. Thank you very much. So I hope you have found this useful.